Welcome, adventurers! I'm Lex, and today we're going to talk about ability scores. But not just any ability scores. We're going to talk about the ability scores and how they were used in, ta-da, the original iteration of the game. Now, this is not the little brown book that first started the game in 1974. I am sadly not fortunate enough to have a copy of that. But it is the basic through master rule set that led to Advanced Dungeons & Dragons and is essentially just a revised version of that little brown book and an expanded version thereof. So, strong. Fairly nimble. Not too smart. Our first ever description of abilities was from the intro adventure that you found in the Player's Handbook of Basic D&D, and it tells us that our character is strong and decently dexterous, but not all that bright. Unsurprisingly, describing a fighter, one of my favorite classes, and I think wildly underappreciated. And I think that really tells us a lot about the mentality of the designers. We'll later find out about wisdom or common sense and charisma or strength of personality. But right from jump, strong, fairly nimble, not too smart. I love this description. I think I can see this character in my head. Big, brawny, lithe, but not dancery, and kind of confused, but down for anything. And I think there's something to be said for that simplicity of description and design. As I was going back through Basic, which it's been too long since I got into play, so I really needed a refresher, I was pleasantly reminded of how many things are still the same from the original iteration of the game. Strength is still used to augment your melee attacks, though not your damage. That comes much later. Dexterity still helps with ranged attacks. Wisdom is used to determine how difficult your spells are to resist for both magic users and priests. I guess not both, because also elves who had magic and were their own class. And Constitution still makes you harder to kill. That being said, I was also really reminded of some of the stark differences from this early game. Notably that intelligence is not nearly as important mechanically as it will be later. It's still important, and it still helps shape what your character can do, can deduce, and can figure out. But there isn't nearly as much mechanical focus on it. It does, however, determine how many languages you can speak and how well you can speak them, ranging all the way from barely coherent in any language to a true polyglot who can speak several. And this was really important, if only because, as though the original game makes it very clear over and over again, magic items are extremely rare, and so things like helms of communication or scrolls of comprehend languages are going to be rare to non-existent. So being able to easily communicate with not only your own party members, but also people from the wider world beyond your small hamlet, and also some of the more monstrous species, would definitely be a valuable asset to have within the party. And then there's charisma, which had one very important rule, which is it allowed you to hire people to do stuff for you. A mechanic that saw the height of its power in 3.5, which led to it essentially being removed from the game, to its loss, in my opinion. Your charisma in the early game told you how powerful of hirelings you could acquire, how likely they were to keep working for you, how much you had to pay them, and how likely they were to stick around when things got hard. And this is really important when we look at the early edition of the game, because the main focus of the game was going into dungeons, killing monsters, and taking their stuff. And as the focus of the game got wider and more diverse, and mechanics came around to support lots of different kinds of game. The focus on porters and torchbearers and crossbow wielding mercenaries becomes less and less, and also wizards to help decipher ancient texts if you don't happen to have one in your party or you don't speak the language the text is written in, and priests to heal up your friends. All of those people could be recruited, and the better your charisma, the more likely you were going to be able to successfully recruit them, and the more likely they were going to be to stick around and not steal from you or leave when things got tough. It takes a truly strong personality to keep a bunch of fighters fighting after an ogre has just ripped one of their allies in half. I think of the scene in the Return of the King when Gandalf reminds the soldiers of Gondor who they are as the armored trolls break through the gates of Minas Tirith. And that truly is what charisma was used for in the early game. Notably, there's not a lot of discussion of using these abilities outside of these very specific parameters. Constitution for health, dexterity for ranged attacks, intelligence for language. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. One, they were essentially inventing a new type of game and a new genre of game. And so they didn't know what they would need rules for. We can see that as we get into Advanced Dungeons & Dragons and Advanced 2nd Edition, which we will do. I intend to make this a series of talking about sort of the history of ability checks as they grow and develop. And we will then start talking about skills and saves. But in the early game, skills and saves had nothing to do with your abilities. They were entirely tied to your class. And remembering that, there weren't mechanics for using your strength to climb things or jump. There weren't mechanics for using your dexterity to sneak around until later. And actually, you start to see that later in First Edition. By the time we get to the Master Rules, which was the last of the sort of compendiums to basic or original D&D, we start seeing modifiers and bonuses to skills based off of high abilities. So we'll back up a little bit. A lot of the things that we think of as skills were class specific, and there was one true master of these abilities, and it is unsurprising because it is to this day the rogue, and back then, of course, it was the thief. So opening locks, finding traps, removing traps. I actually really love that those are separate, and I like that in 5th edition trap breaking is a multi-step process, and I think that's great. Climbing walls, I really love that it's specifically climb walls. Your rogue can't climb trees to save their life, forget about it. But walls, hell yeah. Moving silently, hide in shadows, 2 separate skills. That stays true up until 5th edition, when stealth, which is several skills in a trench coat. I don't want to get off on that tangent. That's a whole other video. Pickpockets and hear noises are all percent successes that go up as you level. You get better and better at them. The percent chance that you'll succeed gets higher and higher. And those are static up until the Master Rules set, where certain abilities give you a higher percent chance, add a bonus percentage. And I think that's really interesting and really shows the transition into Advanced Dungeons & Dragons when we start getting the skill system, where you have this synergy of skill and ability that will become, in some form, the norm through to the modern game. And I think it's really cool that it took, not in the grand scheme of things, very long for that to start showing its head. And when you read, that a rogue with a dex of 16 gets a 10% bonus on move silently and hide in shadows and pickpocket, you can start seeing that +3 to dex to sleight of hand that we all know now. So yeah, I think that's really neat. Listening was its own bespoke mechanic that you got better at as a thief, and that you were naturally better at as a halfling, dwarf, and elf, keeping in mind that those were classes in the original game. The other thing that I think is really interesting from the early game that if memory serves, doesn't even make it into second edition and is completely gone by the time we get into Wizards of the Coast, was the idea of a prime requisite, which was a stat that if it was higher than 13, gave you bonus experience points based on your class. And 13 was pretty high because this is still in the era where you're rolling 3d6, no modifiers, and that's just your number. There were mechanics in later games, starting in Expert, where you could move your numbers around. It's the beginnings of the point buy system that many people use today, but it was certainly not the norm, and it was in many ways a alternate rule. So 13's pretty high, and depending on the class. So, for example, your prime requisite stat in Fighter was Strength. And if you had a Strength higher than 13, you got an XP bonus, which meant your fighter leveled faster. For Magic users, it was Intelligence. For Priests, it was Wisdom. For Thieves, unsurprisingly, it was Dexterity. For Halfling, Dwarf, and Elf, which were all classes in the original game, they had two prime requisite classes. You had to have both of them at above 13 in order to get your bonus XP, which meant that you had to really roll hot for it to be worthwhile to play them. This dovetails into something else that has gone away in the modern game, which is ability score minimums. And this makes its way all the way through 3.5, where you were required to have a certain number in a score in order to have access to certain abilities. But we'll talk about that later. What is really notable in the early game, both in the lack of mechanics and in the way that they talk about running the game and talk about the relationship between the dungeon master and the player, is that there's a real lack of mechanics for a lot of things that we have mechanics for now. Jump, climb, swim, tumble, acrobatics, all of the knowledges. Instead, there's a much more of a focus on dialogue between the player and the dungeon master, and using common sense to decide whether something is viable and makes sense. And I think there's something really great about that. I think that the idea that, like, ultimately the dungeon master is the arbiter of the rules in the scenario, but there's a certain expectation that if your player says, my very strong character who grew up in the woods their whole life is going to climb this tree, there's this assumption that you're going to say yes. And there's this sort of empowerment to say yes. And then if you say no, you got to back it up with receipts. No, because the tree's so big around that you couldn't possibly reach around it, and the lowest branches are easily 20 feet off the ground. So even though your character is an exceptional climber, without equipment, you can't scale this tree. Unless you come up with another option than just trying to brute force it. And that sort of give and take is something that, as we get crunchier and crunchier, as the game gets more and more rules, that dialogue, that empowerment to say no but is in many ways handicapped by a player being able to waggle a rule or a mechanic in your face as the DM and say, yeah, but I rolled this number. And there's just none of that in this. It takes until the second set of the game, Expert, which came out in 1985, so 11 years after the game first was announced, that we get mechanics or mentions of a mechanic for climbing that isn't a rogue climbing walls. And it literally is like, your players, your characters, might want to climb things other than walls, and they might not be rogues. Here's a couple of ideas of how to manage that. And it's not even a hard codified system, and it's not in the player section. It's for the dungeon master. It's, hey, we hear you that your players are climbing on shit. Here's a way to have mechanics if you don't want to just have a discussion. But the fact that because you've got these 6 abilities, they do fairly specific things, and there's not a lot of support outside of that other than your common sense and sort of agreed upon parameters of the fiction you're existing in, is something that I wish the game taught more, and something that I'm going to try to encourage and empower in a way that I run my table, where dice rolling is the last step of anything you try, and often unnecessary. And I want to try to empower you all as we go through and watch the game get more and more complicated, and then less complicated, because with all of its rules, 5th edition still doesn't touch late 2nd edition and the height of 3.5. But I want to try to, by looking into these older games and sort of trying to learn some of that older philosophy, maybe bring back a little of that ability to remove the dice from the equation. And I think if you give it a try and you sort of remember that those core 6 abilities tell us about your character, but not what your character can do. Strong, fairly nimble, not too smart. I think there's something that can be really found in trying to internalize that the rules are there and are important, and mechanical proficiency is extremely important, but the ability to discuss a situation and reach a consensus is more important, and using mechanics and rules just because they exist as a hammer to get your way, either as a player or a DM, I think ultimately makes the game less good, less fun, less. And so I definitely took a lot from reading these and seeing that these 6 stats are a starting point for what your character can plausibly do, but not the ceiling or the floor, and that you don't need a whole lot other than that to have some really good games of D&D. Some of the most evocative and fun games of D&D I have ever played have been early editions of it, especially like Basic and Expert, where it's fast and you try something and then it fails or it doesn't, and then you try something else, or you try something different, and there's this element of creation in it that I think can get lost with the more mechanically dense systems. So yeah, this was a little rambly. We'll talk about, I'm going to do a whole video on the history of saving throws, which are fascinating because they start so different from how they end. But just as an introduction to where this hobby came from, and some stuff that I think we can take from that very early iteration of the game. So, yeah. If you like this, if you want to keep following us, if you think it's interesting, please like, follow, share. We are a brand new channel and I'd love to see this turn into something bigger, but let me know what you think in the comments. Let me know what you'd like to hear about. I'm going to be putting up some polls on our Discord, which the link is in the comments for next episodes, because I'm going to need to do something in between while I solidify the script for 2nd edition. And I will hopefully see y'all in the future to talk more about gaming and all that it has given all of us. All right. Bye for now. All right. Stay safe. Stay nerdy. Stay wonderful. And I'll see y'all later. Bye.